Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at a best case scenario for the GOP in the Senate races. Now we're going to take a look at all of these toss-up Senate races and analyze what a realistic best case scenario for the GOP could be in November's midterm. So of course we're going to look at all of these races that aren't currently categorized as safe races. These are races that either party will win 12 points or more. Even some of these safer blue states like Illinois and Oregon, which tend to be states that Democrats win by 16, 17 points in general elections, these are still going to be considered safe, even in a best case scenario for Republicans, because fundamentally, Senate races are a lot different than statewide races. That's one of the reasons why I've kept these as safe Democrats. So anyway, we're going to get into all of these in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So anyway, let's get straight into it. So we'll start off with the state of Washington and make our way east across the country. Tiffany Smiley is the Republican candidate going up against incumbent Patty Murray, the Democrat, running for a sixth term in the United States Senate. And so far, polling in this race has been surprisingly interesting, given the fact that the state of Washington is not exactly a competitive state on the federal level. Joe Biden won the state of Washington by 19.2%, not exactly a very competitive state for Republicans and a very safe state on the presidential level. And it's really been that way since the 2008 election. There really hasn't been any situation where the margin's gone within about 12 points for the Democratic Party. But taking a look at the polls for this race so far, Patty Murray is only up by about 8 or 9 points, depending on which aggregate you look at. Obviously, the average overall has Murray up by 9 points. So looking at that, and given the fact that in reputable polls like Emerson, for instance, Tiffany Smiley is only down by 9 points. In some polls, she's only down by 4. Again, these seem to be Republican internals. But overall, polling has been pretty decent for the Republican candidate. And even if the polls are accurate and spot on, this would be a likely margin for the Democratic Party. Now, ultimately, I think the polls will be roughly on the money. I predict in my normal prediction that this will be about a D plus 10 race. I think in a best case scenario, Tiffany Smiley could overperform expectations and probably get this race at about 7 points or so, but I think that's realistically the closest you're going to see out of the state of Washington. Again, even a best case scenario for the GOP is still a likely Democratic victory, because again, this is a federal race. This is not a statewide race. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not moving this into the lean category or anything like that. If Tiffany Smiley was running for governor, let's say, and it was an open seat against a bad Democrat, it'd be a totally different story. Moving on down to the state of Nevada, Adam Laxalt is a pretty strong challenger to Catherine Cortez Masto. He outran Dean Heller in the 2018 governor's race. He only lost by 4. Dean Heller, as an incumbent, by the way, lost by 5 points. If we take a look at some of the polling for this race so far, Adam Laxalt is leading in the average so far by 1.4%. Real Clear Politics has him up by 2. I have it as lean Republican in my main prediction. I think it's likely to stay about the same, even in a best case scenario. I could see maybe Laxalt winning by about 4 points in a best case, maybe 5, although I think that's a stretch. You'd have to see really stark trends in Clark County, for instance. You'd have to see a huge sort of Miami-Dade shift in Clark County in order to get something like that. And I don't think that's exactly likely, although in a best case scenario, perhaps it is somewhat possible. Moving on down to the state of Arizona, Blake Masters, who is challenging Mark Kelly for this seat right now, currently is in an uphill battle. Polls currently have him down by about 5 points in the average, 4.5 in RCP, although the polls have been tightening in recent weeks. But in a best case scenario, an upset is certainly likely. And in fact, in my prediction, I've had this as tilt Republican. I really go back and forth sometimes with this race, especially because Mark Kelly is probably the strongest of all the incumbents. For whatever reason, he's very popular. And he's also outperformed in 2020 and in previous polling situations like that. So I think ultimately a best case scenario, Blake Masters probably beats Mark Kelly by about 3 to 4 points. Again, this is a best case scenario. This would imply a pretty decent sized wave around the country in order to get Blake Masters in that position. You know, my current prediction, again, is Blake Masters probably wins by 1.5 points or so. But in this situation, he wins by a comfortable lean margin. Moving on over to the state of Colorado, Joe O'Dea, I've always said, is a very good fit for Colorado. I think he's running in the wrong state, personally. I think if he was running in a closer state, perhaps he would be doing a lot better. Nevada, I think he'd be a really good fit for, especially. Taking a look at the polls, though, Bennett is up by 7 points in RCP. The overall average has him up by 7.9. Most recent poll from Marist College has O'Day down by 7, has O'Day down by 6. I think a best case scenario could see O'Day bring this within a lean margin. I don't think it's very likely that we're going to see a Cory Gardner type upset, even in a best case scenario. Again, I'm saying a realistic best case scenario. Obviously, a best case scenario for the GOP would be every one of these states going red. That's never going to happen. But, a 2014 style victory is sort of out of the question in 2022 because Colorado as a state politically has changed so much in just a short period of time. Again, the Denver suburbs, which back in 2014 were going to Mark Udall by less than 3 percentage points, went to Joe Biden in 2020 by somewhere around 20 points, 15 points. And we could take a look at the presidential level. But, these margins were pretty crazy. 16 points. Joe Biden getting 61% in some of these counties, 57%. So these are counties that back in 2014 were going light red, light blue, dark blue in today's political map. And again, we can go back to a better race, I think, for the Republicans, which is a race where Trump's not on the ballot, Cory Gardner, the incumbent senator. But even then, he's still losing these counties by 14 points, losing the county by almost 20 points, losing by 13 points. So he's still doing extremely poorly, although he's not doing so bad in Douglas County, which Trump came pretty close to losing. I think it was single digits for him. He ended up winning by double, and some of these other areas, El Paso, etc. But I really think a red Colorado is out of the question at best case scenario. I think best case for Republicans is that Joe O'Day keeps it at about 5 points or so. And that's sort of been my prediction overall. I think he will overperform the polls. Again, Michael Bennett's not exactly the strongest incumbent, and he is somewhat of a chronic underperformer when it comes to some of these races. Taking a look at Wisconsin, this is a race that many expect to go to the Republicans by a lean margin. This was one of the closest states in 2020. Joe Biden only won Wisconsin by 0.6%. That's a narrower margin than Trump won the state back in 2016 when he won it for the first time since 1984 by 0.7%. I certainly think a best case scenario for Ron Johnson in this situation obviously would be a win, since I think he's projected to win already. If we take a look at some of the polls out of Wisconsin so far, Ron Johnson has been up in all of the latest polls except one Democratic leaning poll, but every one of them he's either tied or leading. And in a state like Wisconsin, which is normally a state that tends to undersample Republicans, overestimate Democrats, it's a really good sign for them already. So in our current projection, Wisconsin is going to the Republicans by a lean margin. And I think potentially if the same underestimation of Johnson does end up happening in a best case scenario, he probably wins this race by a likely margin, 6.5 points or so. It sounds pretty crazy, but again, we're talking a best case scenario for the Republicans. Moving on over to Ohio, I've often said that I don't think J.D. Vance is exactly the strongest candidate. Tim Ryan is a pretty good candidate. He is a generic Democrat. He votes with Biden basically 100% of the time. He is good at sort of putting on that middle class, working class sort of look in areas where he's from, like northeastern Ohio, which from 2016 to 2020 actually got more Republican. These trends continue to exacerbate themselves in rural Ohio, even as places like the Columbus area and other urban and suburban counties trended more to the left, as they have in the rest of the country. A lot of areas in rural Ohio continue to trend more rightward. So in a best case scenario, again, we have Donald Trump winning the state of Ohio by 8.1% in 2020. I think it's likely that the best that J.D. Vance could do is probably about 10 points or so. I don't think that's realistic, but again, this is a best case scenario. He overperforms Trump in the suburbs, and he overperforms across the board, except maybe in northeastern Ohio, where I think Tim Ryan would still probably do slightly better than Joe Biden in 2020. Moving on up to New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan is the incumbent senator here. She's not exactly the best campaigner from what I've gathered. She hasn't really been doing a whole lot of events around the states or appearances, but this is a Democratic state, and currently Maggie Hassan is up 7.6% in the polling average. The latest poll has Don Bolduc down by 7 points. We have Trafalgar, which has Bolduc down by 3. I think potentially in a best case scenario, you could see an upset in this state, especially since Maggie Hassan is not exactly very popular. New Hampshire tends to be a very swingy state, especially when you consider the large swing from 2016 to 2020. In 2016, Donald Trump lost the state of New Hampshire by about 3,000 votes, less than 3,000 votes. And of course, in 2020, he ended up losing the state by about 7 points, a pretty considerable vote margin as well. So a huge shift in New Hampshire. I think an upset is possible in a best case scenario. I think it'd be very narrow. I think it'd be within a point or so, and it would probably be due to third party voters. But I think Don Bolduc, in a best case, would probably pull an upset for the GOP. That puts the GOP currently at 50 Senate seats so far. Moving on down to Connecticut. This is not a state that I've really ever talked about on the Senate level. And in fact, in all of my previous predictions, I've had it as safe blue. But in this case, we're talking about a best case scenario for the Republican Party. I think it could possibly be below a safe margin. Republicans can get it within about 10 or so. Zeroing in on this race in particular, if we take a look at some of the polling out of this race, I don't think the Republican nominee, Laura Levy, is very special in any way. Again, a lot of these projections have it as safe or likely Democratic. I think potentially you could just see typical Republican overperformance, probably get it within 10 points or so. Again, I think it's very unlikely, but again, a best case scenario where Republicans are perhaps even flipping one of the congressional districts or so. I certainly think you could probably get this state just within under 10 percentage points, but that's really about it. I don't expect it to happen, but I think in a best case, it's somewhat possible. Moving on over to Pennsylvania. Now, this is certainly, again, one of the most contested, hard-fought states, I think, in the entire country on the Senate level. I think Arizona really only rivals it as one of these states that really could go either way. Maybe Georgia as well. I think Nevada is sort of leaning in the Republicans' direction. But again, we're talking about a best-case scenario for the GOP. And taking a look at Pennsylvania, I think it's certainly possible that not only Dr. Oz wins in a best-case scenario, but he wins by a couple of points. If we take a look at the polls so far, currently the average has shifted a little bit since the Trafalgar poll. Fetterman is only up 3.4% according to RCP. The overall average has him up 4.6%. I think in a best case scenario, Oz overperforms these polls by about 5 points or so. Again, this is implying that the average holds true to Election Day, and I actually think this is going to narrow up even more as we come to Election Day, although I still expect John Fetterman to probably have a polling advantage on Election Day. But taking a look at these polls again, I think it's very possible that in a best case scenario, you see Oz replicate sort of the Toomey strategy in Pennsylvania, which is running up the margins in suburban Philadelphia while sort of losing some ground in rural Pennsylvania. I think a best case scenario would combine both of these situations. You'd have Oz doing better in suburban Philly while also doing slightly better than Trump's rurals, although I don't think he'd do as well as Mastriano's rurals. But in a best case scenario for the GOP, I think I could see Oz winning by about 2 points, maybe 2.5 points, potentially even 3, just because Pennsylvania is so polarized. Even in a best case scenario, Pat Toomey in 2010 beat his opponent, Joe Sestak, by just 2 percentage points. And of course, Pennsylvania was a lot different back then, but in this situation, I think a 3-point margin of victory is about the best you're going to get out of the Republicans in Pennsylvania. Moving on down to North Carolina, this is a state where Republicans are already expected to win. They're expected to win by a decent amount. North Carolina is always sort of this lean to likely Republican state in these off-year races. A lean state, I think, generally speaking. Looking at the polling average, Bud is up by 1.5%. My current predictions have it going to Bud by about 6. I think the best case, maybe he wins by 7 or so, but I really don't think North Carolina is as prone to wave years as other states. That's one of the reasons why I don't think you're going to see some crazy margin out of North Carolina. Even if there was a best case for the GOP, I think the most you would see him win by is maybe 8 points, but that would be crazy and sort of unprecedented. I think it's more like 6 or 7. I don't think North Carolina changes very much from my current prediction. Moving on down to the state of Georgia. Georgia is, of course, interesting because it's the only state on the map that has a runoff system. If no candidate gets over 50% of the vote, this will go to a runoff. Currently in the polling so far, Warnock is up. He's actually up by about 4 points. So he's had a bit of a surge recently. Of course, we had a period back in early September and August where Walker was actually up ahead. Now that's not the case anymore. September's come around. Warnock's established a much more solid polling lead throughout the cycle. Now, ultimately, I think in a best case scenario, you're going to see these poll numbers sort of narrow up. I actually think in a best case, Walker avoids a runoff and probably wins by about 3 points, which I think is a very bold prediction. But when you think about the fact that Brian Kemp is also on the ballot and he's probably going to win by 5 or 6 points even, he's probably going to drag Walker over the finish line. In a best case scenario, We could even see Kemp win by 7 points in Georgia, which would be something we haven't seen since 2014. But if that's really the case, we could see a shift like that going on in Georgia. And in the best case, I think Walker wins by about 3. Finally, we go on to Florida. Not much to talk about here. I've moved my prediction in Florida. I currently have it as likely Republican. That's a lot of what the pundits are saying as well. Rubio is only up in the polls by 2 to 3 points. That's mainly because we have a lot of Democratic-leaning polls that have this race a lot closer than I think it actually is. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think Rubio is probably going to win by about 10 points or so. I don't think this race is going to be particularly close. Rubio always overperforms in the state of Florida. The polls really missed this state back in 2020, and I think they will again in 2022. And I think certainly you're going to see, as we get more polls coming out in the future, that the gap is going to widen between them. Again, some polls that are skewing the aggregate here have Val Demings up by 4, Val Demings up by 2. A lot of these polls have Rubio up by 8, 5, and so on. So pretty decisive wins. So ultimately, best case scenario, Rubio probably wins by about 12 points, which was my previous prediction. So this puts the GOP at 54 Senate seats to the Democrats' 46. And that, I think, is the best case for the GOP in the Senate, realistically speaking. So anyway, thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. I'll be uploading every day from now until the midterms, fingers crossed. So please support the channel in any way that you can. Liking and subscribing is a good place to start. As always, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.